struggling. Obama's team, over the last few days, is beginning to remember a lesson that they learned very effectively during the campaign last year and the year before, that you can't just talk to the home team. President Obama did a one-on-radio interview yesterday, and it wasn't with Ed Schultz and it wasn't with Rachel Maddow. It was with an extremely conservative host. The President knew that most of the people listening to that program were not supporters of his proposal. But by reaching out beyond his ideological base, he's beginning a conversation that has dissipated over the last several months and beginning to try to explain to people who disagree with him why what he's doing might have some value. The problem you run into, whether you're Obama or Bush or Schwarzenegger, Boxer, choose your politician, is if you only talk to your own team, if you only work to mobilize your own base, what happens very quickly is your opponents, people who think you are their opponent, begin to think of you instead as their enemy. And you become a caricature, you become a cartoon character. And once you lose the ability or lose the willingness to talk to them directly, you leave it to other people to interpret your words for you. And as the President and Governor both learned over the last several months, that rarely works well. When you let your loyal opposition define what you're trying to do to their base, they're not inclined to give you the benefit of the doubt. So I think when you see Obama making the efforts like he did yesterday, it's steps like that that I think are much more necessary part of governing than campaigning. People aren't ever going to sign up if you don't talk to them. So then you follow to those corners.
From a practical level, you also butt up into the problem you discussed earlier, which is that the public may come to a different view, but you're still operating with people whose districts are isolated to one view.
Well, and that again is why I think that the passage of Prop 11 was such an important step. Even if 100 out of those 120 legislators still toe a very, very hard-line partisan line on one side or the other, the fact that you have even a small cluster, a couple of dozen of legislators, willing to venture into the middle of the playing field makes it much easier for an executive, again, of either party, to get things done. And I emphasize either party because, as I know many of you remember, Ray Davis had just as many problems with the liberal wing of his party as either Arnold Schwarzenegger or Pete Wilson had with the conservative wing of theirs. And that does not suggest, as I said earlier for a moment, that those liberal or conservative viewpoints are invalid. Merely that they need to be supplemented by the more centrist viewpoints of a significant portion of the left.
One of the things you talked about was lack of accountability because the public's unaware of services for defensible and indefensible reasons. And then you said that people tend to focus locally when they get angry. Are there other reasons that you think this happens? What are the solutions, do you think, if we had a more moderate legislature, that people would become more engaged?
The question was, if the legislature were more moderate, would people be more likely to engage at the state level in politics rather than nationally and locally? And it is sort of frustrating to work in state politics because the president and Congress get all this media attention. Local politics is local; it's right on your block in your neighborhood. The state's caught sort of somewhere in between. I don't necessarily know that a more moderate legislature makes that difference, but a more responsive legislature does. And again, even if you have a couple of dozen members out of 120 whose re-election campaigns are more dependent on them being responsive to those people who sent them in, I think that encourages voters to get more involved. First of all, you're not going to get 38 million people involved in state politics. But even for those civic and community leaders who might be more inclined to get involved, for those of you who've ever gone to testify before a state legislative committee, it is a discouraging, if not depressing, experience. Because unless you are testifying on behalf of a piece of legislation with which you have the sympathies of the chair or the ranking minority member, you tend to be treated very dismissively. And if I were a legislator, and if you were a legislator, that would be human nature too. Because your willingness of being responsive to the people who make the trip to Sacramento to talk about things that are important to them, if that were relevant to your re-election, you'd be a lot more likely to be responsive. And I think the culture would change up there if you did see a dozen, 15, 20 people who really did understand, for their own political survival, the need of engaging more directly and more thoughtfully and more responsibly with the people who elected them. So it's not a matter of moderation. it's a matter of engagement.
I'm just curious what your thoughts are on parliaments and its role in sort of the polarization of legislature, and if it has a role in sort of people who call the dysfunction of the state legislature in California. And just your thoughts on that.
I'll come into this conversation to offer some admissions before I answer you. First of all, in 1990, I was a very strong supporter of Proposition 140, which originally imposed term limits on our state legislature and statewide elected officials. Earlier this decade, I ran the campaign against a ballot initiative sponsored by then Senator and Senator Corrado that would have extended term limits. So, at least from the outset, I tend to think that they were a good idea, because I will admit to you, I'm enough of an optimist to think that in the state of 38 million people, there are more than 120 individuals, more than 120 men and women who are smart enough to take on the challenges of state governance. And I have to say that one of the things I like most about term limits is the diversity that they have brought to the state capitol. Not only more female legislators, not only more minority legislators, but a diversity of experience. You get doctors, you get teachers, you get small business owners, you get labor organizers, people whose prior pre-political experience gives them a standing in the conversation that somebody like me couldn't ever have. All that said, I worry, as I suspect you do too, about a system that allows someone to become Speaker of the State Assembly during their second year in elected office, or that makes someone a committee chair or ranking minority member on a committee before they know how to find the restrooms in the state capitol. After we defeated the term limits extension several years ago, then Speaker Wesson came to me. And by the way, that was the easiest campaign I ever ran at any level of politics. Beating a proposal by politicians to extend term limits, oh my gosh, it might have well been an initiative to deprive orphans of ice cream and puppies in California. But after it was over, then Speaker Wesson called me in and he said, hey, look, you had your fun, but I think you'd agree that there is a problem here. And I agreed that there was. And he and I and a few other members of both parties in the State Assembly fashioned a proposal with which many of you are familiar, the so-called 12-year combined limit. The idea being, for political purposes, that you shorten the overall limits from 14 years, 8 in the Senate, 6 in the Senate, to 12 years of service, but that those 12 years can be served in any combination you like. So you can serve all 12 of those years in the Assembly or the Senate. I like that compromise, because it does allow for turnover. It does allow for fresh perspectives and increased diversity to represent the state's people. But it also, rather than rushing people in and out in 6 years, by giving an individual 12 years in the State Assembly or State Senate, allows them to move up the ladder more gradually than they're forced to now. Form of that initiative, as most of you know, was on the ballot a year or so ago. Legislators of both parties weren't able to help themselves and put an initiative on the ballot that would have imposed a 12-year limit, except for the current legislators, who would have all gotten 12 more years. It was pretty much defeated by voice vote. I think if they were to come back with a clean 12-year combined limit, that I think preserves the professional and ideological and demographic diversity, but also allows a more gradual ascension to power in the legislature, to me that's the best of both worlds.